The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IAssessed Professional Development webinar today. This webinar is being hosted by ICPSR. My name is Amy Pienta. We are delighted to have you join us today. In the unlikely event that you are experiencing audio issues, please look for a pop-up audio window that may be behind your GoToWebinar screen. I'd like to remind you that this webinar will be recorded and available on the IAssist Data YouTube channel in a couple of days. And as somebody who showed up today, both the recording and the slides will be sent to you via email. We welcome your questions today for our speaker, but please type those questions into the box marked question that is part of the GoToWebinar control panel that you should see somewhere on the right of your screen. If you're joining us via phone or mobile app, look for that question mark icon on the bottom of your screen. You may need to swipe left to see the presentation. So like I said, the questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Sarah Young, who is hosting, will be moderating that and reading them to Kayla. Otherwise, I just want to thank you for joining today. And pass the webinar over to Sarah Young to introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Amy. Well, we're very excited to be kicking off our 2021 webinar series with Kayla Lar-Son. Kayla is the Indigenous Programs and Services Librarian at the University of British Columbia. She's also the program manager for the Indigitization program at UBC. She also is an instructor at the University of Alberta, where she co-teaches the Indigenous Library and Information Studies course. So today, Kayla is going to be speaking on Indigenous data sovereignty, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Kayla.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being here this morning. So this morning my talk will be called Data as Relation, Indigenous Data Sovereignty, and the Ethic of Care. So this is just a bit of an outline of how this presentation is going to go, a little bit of introductions and acknowledgements, speaking to Indigenous relationality, Indigenous data, humanizing data, Indigenous data sovereignty, protections, principles, and practices. How do we move forward, and then time for questions at the end. So just starting off today with the land acknowledgement, I would like to acknowledge the land that I'm joining you from today. I'm an uninvited guest on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I would like to acknowledge all the communities that have been on the lands that you are joining from since time immemorial. So why do we acknowledge the land? I know we have a very vast community joining us today for this webinar, so it's important to recognize why we acknowledge the land. So some of the reasons that we acknowledge the land is to acknowledge the people who have lived on these lands since time immemorial, and to acknowledge the complicated histories that we are on. So I've provided some resources for everybody on how to figure out which land you're on, whose land you're on, as well as why and how to do Indigenous land acknowledgements, because not everybody does them, or not everybody's familiar to the concept of a land acknowledgement and why they're important. And land acknowledgements are important for this conversation that we're having today and thinking about the communities that we are in. So locating oneself. So locating oneself means it reconnects ourselves, our peoples, and our stories as a powerful form of cultural resistance and the basic building block to having deep relationships with each other. So how do you locate yourself, and why is it important? So one way to locate yourself is when meeting people or going to a community for the first time. It's acknowledging who your kin are. It acknowledges the lands that you're connected to, so not just the land where you were born, but the land where you're currently living, or the lands that you feel a deep connection to. It shows who you're accountable to, the communities that you're accountable to, your colleagues that you're accountable to, your family and kin that you're connected to and accountable to, and as well as the land that you're residing on now. It helps to acknowledge our biases, our positions, and our connections to one another. And again, this will be important for this talk today. So it's important to locate yourself. And this is kind of what it looks like. So this is how I locate myself. So I like to start off by always acknowledging my name. I'm Kayla Lar-Son. I'm from Amiskwichi, which means the Beaver Hills. I grew up in a small town called Tofield, Alberta, which is Treaty 6 territory, but I have connections to communities in Manitoba and throughout different parts of Alberta, Canada. I identify as a Métis and Ukrainian settler ancestry, and my identity informs my worldviews. I'm currently residing on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I work for the University of British Columbia. So often when I'm starting off presentations or I'm meeting people from the first time, I like to tell them a little bit about where I'm from, who my family is, and also other communities that I'm connected to. So locating ourselves and acknowledging the land that we are on plays into this concept of Indigenous relationality. So Indigenous relationality is kind of really incorporated into this quote here, which says, constituted by our histories and our culturally embodied knowledges and life forces that connect us to respective lands, our creators, and all living entities and our ancestors. So that's pretty much in this sentence what relationality is. But if we break it down a little bit more, relationality goes beyond the Western understanding of kin. It encompasses complex kin relations with things like the land, which includes the earth, water, sky, our non-human connections like animals and spiritual connections. It's sometimes referred to as all of our relations. So if you've heard the kind of concept of relationality before, often it's through that all of our relations. And as well, it's associated with the protocols and shape the stewardship and ethical practices that us as Indigenous people have. As well, relationality is embedded within Indigenous knowledge systems and laws. So as kind of the larger umbrella term, relationality is all of this, but in general for this talk, relationality is really that encompassing of the kin connections, the relationships with not only just humans, but also the relationship with the land and our ancestors. So when it comes to relationality and the concept of relationality, all different communities, and in a Canadian context is mostly what I'll be talking about today, but relationality in Indigenous communities is expressed differently and is often expressed through different laws and governance models. This is the one that I'm most familiar with, as I was born in Treaty 6 territory, which is Cree territory. And these are the Nehia or Cree relationality laws. So we have Wekotowin, which is the interconnectedness of our relationships. We have Miawasituin, which is the law that governs us having or possessing good relations with one another. And all of these connections are rooted in the concept of Pimatuasuin, which denotes life itself. And when we bring all of these concepts together, it informs how we connect with the land, how we connect with other humans, and how we connect with our ancestors. And another quote. And so one thing that you'll notice as we're going throughout this presentation is I tried to incorporate photos into the slides from different areas and different landscapes that have meaning to me. So you'll see a lot of photos of the Northwest Coast embedded in here, but also photos of Alberta and Treaty 6. So this photo is actually from my hometown, which is outside of Tofield, Alberta. This is Beaver Hill Lake. And the quote that's on this slide is, when we talk about the land is part of who we are. It is mixed in our blood, our past, our current, and our future. We carry all of our ancestors in us. They are around us, as you all do. So we all, in our own way and in our own communities, have a different understanding of relationality and our own connections to the land and what the land means to us. So Indigenous data. So now kind of switching from kind of the understanding of Indigenous relationships, relationship to the land, relationships to kin, to a little bit more of a talk on Indigenous data. So historically, with Indigenous communities, research and data collection has been done with very problematic practices in a Canadian context and also in a more international context as well. There's a lack of community control in the way that research and data was conducted and arguably is currently conducted, and where the data is going to be disseminated, stored, and when it will be destroyed. So research and data collection in Indigenous communities has also been, and still arguably continues to be, a deficit-based practice and dismisses any types of narratives of resiliency in communities. For example, this can be things like documenting and examining trauma, pain, and loss in research and not actually respecting the topic that's discussing or understanding how Indigenous communities are resilient and in ways that they understand this resiliency coming out of traumatic past experiences in their lives. So some of this research could be like documenting things that happened in residential school in Canada, missing and murdered Indigenous women, without actually speaking to the resiliency of communities coming out of these events and the conversations that are now opening up. It's not to be dismissive of the trauma that has happened and continues to happen from these events, but we also need to look just beyond trauma and look towards the resiliency of our communities and of Indigenous people in general. So when we're talking about Indigenous data, we're looking at not just data, but also Indigenous knowledges that inform Indigenous data that's being collected. So when it comes to Indigenous knowledges, there are different types. One that we normally see when we're having issues with Indigenous data sovereignty is around traditional knowledges. Not to say that other Indigenous data, like contemporary health data, should not remain sovereign in Indigenous communities, because it should. But when it comes to traditional knowledge, there's a little bit of an extra step and a different type of ethical care that needs to come with it. But here is just kind of a broad overview of what exactly Indigenous traditional knowledges are. So traditional knowledges, and I pluralize this because there's more than one knowledge when it comes to Indigenous people. So traditional knowledges are the know-hows, skills, and practices that develop, sustained, and passed from generation to generation within a community, often forming part of a cultural or spiritual identity. However, there is no universally accepted definition of traditional knowledge, but in general, it can be said that traditional knowledges, in a general sense, embrace the content of the knowledge itself, as well as traditional cultural expressions, including distinctive signs and symbols associated with traditional knowledges. More in the narrower sense, it refers to knowledges as such, in particular as knowledges resulting from intellectual activity in a traditional context, and includes how-to practices, skills, and innovations. So when we're speaking about Indigenous cultural expressions, these can be things like dance, art, designs, names, symbols, performances, ceremonies, architectural forms, crafts, narratives. So it really is a broad, a very broad category for what Indigenous cultural expressions are. And then also we have genetic resources. So genetic resources are also part of this Indigenous data. So genetic resources and other biological resources constitute unique subject matter for IP protection ever since IP systems began to protect innovation in modern life sciences as early as the 1970s. They include, for example, microorganisms, plant varieties, etc. So there's a lot of work being done right now on genetic resources and Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data. So what does Indigenous data look like? This is something that I get asked often when I'm speaking about Indigenous data. So Indigenous data is quite a large data set, and there's kind of three different sections that it can be broken down into. The first is data on Indigenous resources and environments. So this can be stuff at like land history, geological information, titles, water information, data about Indigenous demographics or social data. This is legal, health, education. It often includes community produced data. And then we have data from Indigenous communities. So this is traditional and cultural data, archival data, oral histories, ancestral knowledge, community stories, etc. So as we can see, Indigenous data is very varied and it spans over different disciplines. So humanizing Indigenous data. So this is the kind of why should you care part of this talk. So data humanization is the right to access So with data humanization, I always like to remind people that the right to access information about individuals is a privilege. Even when I teach students about Indigenous data sovereignty, I like to remind them as information professionals with access to very, in some cases, sensitive data about individuals, this is a privilege, especially when working with historical data that, you know, is missing things like free and informed and prior consent. Nobody gave us necessarily the okay to be looking at this information about our lives, and we need to remember that. So data humanization creates connections between the information and between the human viewer. When we connect the data in this way, it allows us to be more empathetic and view the data in a different way that is more informed by our own selves and our own feelings. So when we look at a data set, instead of just seeing numbers or instead of just seeing, you know, places, graphs, maps, we can actually begin to conceptualize this as the community, as those who are involved and whose data this belongs. So Indigenous data as ancestor, Indigenous data as future, relationality and accountability. So as we were talking before about locating ourselves, the land informing us as Indigenous people, how the land shapes me and informs my practices as a librarian, as an instructor. This is very important. So when I'm working with data, I think about the community that's involved. I think about my own family. I think about who I'm accountable to by even being a steward of this data. So this is kind of changing that traditional mindset that we're often taught in things like LIS, which is Library and Information Studies institutions, where we're taught in some cases to be neutral, to remove yourself from the object. But in this case, it's switching it and it's flipping our mind frame where we're actually involving ourselves into what we're seeing and seeing it not just as a piece of paper, something on your computer, but you're reconceptualizing it as almost an ancestor, as future generations. And because we have the amazing opportunity to have Robin Wall-Kimmer, Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmer at UBC doing a presentation this week, I thought I would pull out this quote because it makes a little bit of sense for this conversation that we're having today. So if we see a maple, so a maple tree as an it, we can take up a chainsaw. However, if we see a maple tree as a her, we think twice. So this is humanizing an object that isn't often humanized. When we humanize it and think differently about it, we have a harder time making those decisions around things like taking a chainsaw to the tree. So when it comes to Indigenous data and humanizing it, in the relational sense, when we, as an Indigenous person, when we are not in the care of those who are belonging to us, it's almost like having a lost ancestor. So when the data is not in our possession as Indigenous peoples, it's like having a long lost relative just out there for everybody to look at, especially when it's data that is having to do with sensitive content, such as health data. So that's why it's important that Indigenous people remain the stewards of their own data. When we think about kind of ethical care and Indigenous data, we need to think outside of the Western understanding of who is relation. Building a little bit more into that talk on relationality and the connection to the land. So not just about humanizing data about humans, but also humanizing data about the land and thinking about land data that pertains to Indigenous community as being part of their relations and having them as being owners of this information. We need to start thinking and acting as ethical stewards of information until it can be returned to the community that is claiming ownership. Another thing that's really important with ethical care of Indigenous data is to be transparent. So transparency is very important when working with Indigenous data, especially if we are in care of this data and it has been given to us through, in some cases, practices that are not necessarily conducive to Indigenous data sovereignty, such as, we have donor agreements for libraries and archives. Sometimes we don't go through ethical considerations when accepting collections. We buy collections, we purchase them. However, we don't always think of, whose information is this, who does it belong to, and what community is claiming it. So when working with Indigenous communities, when it comes to data repatriation, we need to be transparent about our processes. We need to be transparent about the policies that we work with and the procedures that we have in our institutions so that we can build relationships with community. And we need to be open. We need to be open to having conversations. We need to be open to even, connecting with communities and saying, we have information about your community. Would you like to work with us? And starting to build those relations with one another. And it is okay to work and to act based on your own feelings and remove any type of kind of thoughts of neutrality when it comes to data. Data in itself is not neutral. Data is collected for reasons. It's collected by individuals for different purposes. And we can act in a way that is not neutral when it comes to data as well. And in some cases, we engage in the best heart learning when we do this. And so we kind of have that aha moment and we understand why it's important to return items to community when we're not trying to remain neutral. So what exactly is Indigenous data sovereignty? So Indigenous data sovereignty is a concept that really does inform working with ethics and Indigenous data and allowing for kind of concept of relationality to be built into this data ethics practice. So when it comes to data, who's in control of the data normally has power. Those who are in power have control, and those who are in kind of this controlling, who have the means of control, have hierarchy and access. But with Indigenous data sovereignty embodies the right for all Indigenous peoples to determine their own economic, social, and cultural development. Indigenous sovereignty allows this. So Canada recognizes that Indigenous peoples have the inherent right to self-govern, and this is guaranteed in Section 35 of the Constitution of Canada. However, when it comes to issues of Indigenous ownership, especially when it comes to Indigenous copyright, we do have competing laws. So Canadian copyright does compete with the Constitution when it comes to Indigenous data and ownership of knowledge. So some current issues with Indigenous knowledge sovereignty. So, and this is from Younging 2010. So expressions of traditional knowledge often cannot qualify for protection because they are too old and therefore supposedly are in the public domain. Also, the author of the material is not often identifiable and thus there are no rights holders in the usual sense of the term, and also that traditional knowledge is collectively collectively owned by different Indigenous groups, and it cannot necessarily be claimed by individuals or corporations for economic gain. So copyright and Indigenous knowledge sovereignty more in the Canadian context. So again, Canadian laws have worked not only to ignore or specifically deny the rights of Indigenous people to practice and maintain their culture and intellectual property, but also have legalized the theft of Indigenous culture and intellectual property through things like the Copyright Act. And again, thinking back to kind of that competing of laws with Section 32 and the Copyright Act. One thing though is that the Canadian government does kind of recognize that there are issues around Canadian copyright, traditional knowledge, and Indigenous data. They do have different resources that individuals can look at around kind of the introduction of intellectual property and protection of Indigenous knowledges in Canada. And one thing kind of about being transparent and open that's really important with this is that the Canadian government has provided these resources in different languages. So if you're more interested and you have these slides, if you click on this link, it will actually take you to slides where you can see the resources about Indigenous traditional knowledge and intellectual property right in a Canadian copyright context in languages like Inuktitut, Cree, Blackfoot, and Anishinaabe. So they are providing this information in a way that makes sense to Indigenous people. However, there actually has to be more done when it comes to legally protecting Indigenous knowledges and traditional knowledges especially, and data from more of a legal standpoint than just necessarily an ethics standpoint. So another kind of issue that we do face in Canada, it's not really a issue in a sense, but more a challenge that we have here in Canada than other countries might have. So in Canada, we have 3 distinct Indigenous groups, and that's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And each one of these groups is diverse with their communities, their language, and their knowledges. So within Canada, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So our Inuit relatives are in the north. We have First Nations across Canada, and we have Métis kind of in the parkland is sometimes how it is described as the Métis homeland, but in general, we have Métis spanning across Canada. So, and even within each one of these communities, there are distinct communities with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. All of these communities are self-governing entities with their own different governance systems and legal practices. As well as Indigenous lands expand beyond just even the border of what we now know as Canada. And so when it comes to Indigenous knowledges that are shared over the border, there is that Canadian and US law, those Canadian and US laws that need to work together to protect those knowledges that are shared by communities across the border. So as you can see, Indigenous communities in Canada are quite expansive. And in some cases, Indigenous data laws, traditional knowledge laws, they might not always be applicable to all of the different communities within a Canadian context. And that's something that we need to be aware of, is that when we're working with communities, especially when it comes to data and knowledge sovereignty, is that it has to be specific for that community. It has to make sense to them. It's not just a one-size-fits-all thing. And that's kind of a challenge with it. Canada being such an expansive country, is that we have this little extra challenge that we have communities with different languages, governance systems, and so it creates a positive challenge for us to try and see how we can make Indigenous data protocols for these communities in a way that is meaningful as well. So Indigenous data sovereignty. Indigenous data sovereignty is kind of this term that has been around for a while. The conversation that we're having today is not a new conversation. This conversation has been happening for well beyond my career as a librarian, or even well beyond my career in university, and it's just something that has piqued my interest in the last couple of years. I worked in digital initiatives for a while. This is the first time that I had ever heard of Indigenous data sovereignty, and it made a lot of sense to me. It made me kind of rethink the data practices that I even had within my own institution and apply it to my family and what was happening within my own family and the rights to their information around things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as health data information and Indigenous people. So Indigenous data sovereignty is the concept that Indigenous nations have the right to ownership and governance over data about them, regardless of where it is held and who claims to hold this data or hold ownership over it. So Indigenous peoples also have the right to access data that supports nation rebuilding, and this often includes access to government documents, historic and contemporary, and archival documents. As well as there are Indigenous data protocols that follow in with this Indigenous data sovereignty. So Indigenous data protocols are things like ownership and inheritance, which, this is ownership at the community level, sometimes individual level, the clan or family level. It is earned by individuals. Not everybody has the right to know everything. Age can inform Indigenous data protocols, gender identity, geography, seasons, techniques such as art and harvesting. As well, these protocols can use kind of collective knowledges from other communities and follow different Indigenous laws, such as we talked about before, like Wokotowin and Mi'o-Osituin. As well, these Indigenous data protocols inform what we do with data when we are going to disseminate it. And that's why this is very important that we build relationships with communities. There is data out there that should not be out there. We need to have conversations with communities on why it should not be out and open and accessible to the public, or why it should be open, out, and accessible to the public, or if it should be only at a community level. A lot of this can be informed by seasonal protocols, ownership, what should actually be out there. So the next kind of thing, going away from Indigenous data sovereignty and now looking into protections, principles, and practices. So when it comes to intellectual property protection, there's kind of two different mechanisms. That's defensive mechanisms and positive mechanisms, also known as defensive protections or positive protections. A defensive protection or mechanism aims to stop people outside the community from acquiring intellectual property rights over traditional knowledges. Positive protection or mechanisms are means of protecting traditional knowledge by the way of enacting laws, rules, and regulations, access and benefit sharing provisions, as well as royalties. This protection is meant to empower communities to promote their own knowledges in a way that makes sense to them and follows community protocols so that it cannot be exploited by others. It's also important to note that some uses of traditional knowledges can be protected through intellectual property system and laws, and that a number of countries have actually developed specific legislation for this. However, it's important to note that if you are interested more in data laws in your country, definitely look into those specific regulations, because they do, in some cases, not transfer to other countries. So they are very specific to where the data is located and where that community is located. As well, we have free, prior, and informed consent. So this is more of a modern-ish concept, free, prior, and informed consent. However, this is something that we can look at in our more historical collections if that's what we're working with. So the free part is the consent free, given voluntarily without coercion, intimidation, or manipulation, a process that is self-directed by the community from whom consent is sought, unencumbered by coercion, expectations, or timelines that are internally imposed. Prior is the consent sought sufficiently in advance of any authorization of commencement of activities, and informed, and so also is the engagement of any type of information that should be prior to seeking consent, also as part of the ongoing consent process. And then also we have consent at the end, the engagement of any type of information that should be provided prior to seeking consent, and also as part of the ongoing consent process. So often when I'm working with historic data collections, I try to see, is there any indication that free, prior, or informed consent was given at any point for this data to even be collected by the researcher. In a more modern context, free, prior, and informed consent is often written into research ethic boards in the Canadian context. So we do have legislations now for kind of bringing in Indigenous data in an ethical way. When working with the historical collections in the past that have been donated by things like researchers or faculty members that are kind of historic nature, we have had them fill out things like ethics forms, which talks about kind of the nature of the data, any type of consent that was given, any considerations to who might actually the data belong to, or kind of digging deeper into the nature of the data, if there was minors involved, Indigenous communities, people of color, and really thinking about the collection and issues of consent and ownership. So as Indigenous data sovereignty has kind of been growing within a Canadian context, there are different organizations that are coming and they are creating these amazing principles and practices that individuals can follow when they are starting to undertake Indigenous data sovereignty projects or working with communities to ensure that their data is remaining sovereign. So the first is the First Nations Principles of OCAP. And this is training provided by the First Nations Governance Center here in Canada. The First Nations Principles of OCAP stand for ownership, control, access, and possession. And these principles assert that First Nations have control over their data collection processes, as well as the ownership and control of how this information can be used. So the OCAP training is a course that you can take. I have provided in the additional resources a link to the OCAP website. So OCAP, though, is specific to First Nations within a Canadian context. So if you're thinking about doing this training on OCAP, I would definitely suggest reaching out to them so that you can have conversations on the training, whether it would fit for your institution, as well as how to partake and more information from them. We also do have from GIDA, which is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and they have the CARE principles, which they have come up with. And CARE principles stand for collective benefit, authority, control, responsibility, and ethics. And so in the additional resources, I've also linked to CARE and kind of more information about GIDA and the individuals who came up with the CARE principles and the different researchers that are working with this organization and doing amazing things when it comes to Indigenous data sovereignty. So moving forward, so this is kind of, Indigenous data sovereignty. Some institutions are doing a really great job at engaging with communities on building these relationships, on reviewing their collections and moving forward. But in some cases, everybody's at different stages of learning. Even myself, when it comes to, learning about Indigenous data sovereignty, I am a newer professional. So for me, I'm always learning. I'm always learning from my colleagues, my mentors, from the individuals who have been doing this for many, many years, the leaders in Indigenous data sovereignty nationally here in what we now know as Canada, as well as on this international platform. So I think moving forward is where we all come together and learn together and have really great conversations with each other about Indigenous data. And having conversations about what we're doing well, but also having those really hard conversations about what is not going well, where we need to go from here, and how we can work together to make this happen. So unpacking it all and unlearning, some of it is an unlearning process. We need to think critically about our work and what we've been taught. I know when I came out of library school, I had to do a little bit of unlearning and unpacking of what I had learned there and really kind of do some heart learning based off my lived experiences and learning from others. One thing to do is also to reach out to local communities. We can't ensure Indigenous data sovereignty is actually happening if we're not actually working with Indigenous communities, because they are at the forefront, the owners of this information. It's important too, when we reach out to communities, we are able to connect and really build crucial relationships and recognize the value of these relationships with Indigenous people as the leaders in these projects. We can educate ourselves in Indigenous knowledge traditions. So this can be doing anything from reading books like Braiding Sweetgrass from Robin Wall Kimmer to, listening to seminars on Indigenous storytelling, on Indigenous knowledge. This is not going out and asking communities to share their sacred knowledge with you or anything like that, but this is just learning about how Indigenous communities even share their knowledge. So, how they share it orally, from generation to generation, what makes sense to them when it comes to data and data sharing practices. We can refuse to do further extractive harm. So this is harder in a sense when you're working for a large institution like I do, a university. There are specific protocols and donor agreements that do happen. However, we can have those hard conversations on why we do things and how we can make our relationships better with communities by changing our policies. We can follow specific Indigenous data protocols. I have seen websites where they are sharing community stories where the page changes from day to night depending on the Indigenous data that is being shared and the stories that are being shared. As well as we can take down stories when they're not supposed to be shared. For an example, in a Cree context, there are stories that are only meant to be shared in the winter and not in the summer, and we can remove those stories in the summertime or put up kind of any type of notice about cultural protocol issues. So again, reviewing our collections, policies, and procedures. One thing to do is also review the scope of your collection. What do you actually have in your collection? Sometimes we have things that turn up that are really exciting, and then sometimes we have collections that turn up that are problematic. We forget that we even have in our care, and we need to sometimes remove those from our collection and put them in dark storage until we have conversations with communities on what to do with them. As well, we need to ensure that Indigenous communities remain sovereign and self-governing entities, allowing for communities to take a leadership role in decision-making, and again, having those different conversations. So when we have difficult conversations with each other, we learn to grow from them. If we don't have difficult conversations around data and viewing data in a different way than just numbers, statistics, points on a map, then we'll never grow in our practices and we'll never be able to have kind of these good relations with communities and open dialogues with communities. So here are the suggested resources. So suggested resources on Indigenous data and knowledge sovereignty, as well as I did add in a suggested resource on Indigenous knowledge organization. I am very fortunate to work for a library system where we have our own knowledge organization and subject headings based off of Brian Deere at the Kwiwa Library. So if you're interested more on the metadata, classification, and subject headings, I did add that in for everybody. And just to kind of end it off with this, data rights are human rights and data rights are Indigenous rights. Hi, thank you, Marseille. Thank you for joining me today. And I'd love to have, a conversation with everybody about how we can reconceptualize data about the land, data about people, our ancestors as relatives, so that we can have better conversations with each other so that we can act in a non-neutral way to ensure that Indigenous data sovereignty practices are being used in our institutions to grow great relationships with communities. All right, so here's my contact. There's my email at work as well as my Twitter, and I've added in the website for the Huiwa Library at UBC, which is where I work, if anyone's interested. So, as well as citations. All right.
Great. Thank you so much, Kayla. That was
I will
wonderful.
put it back to this page. Yes, you're welcome.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a large virtual round of applause happening out there. We have about 200 folks on the call. So
yes, I saw that. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. It's always great to have, you know, early morning discussion about this, and just, yeah, it was a great time. Thank you for having me.
yeah, we really appreciate it. We have about 13 minutes for questions or so. So I am going to open it up for questions, and I know, given how many people are on, we might get a whole bunch, but we'll do what we can to address as many as we can.
Sure.
Again, if you have questions, just type them into the box that says questions. Should be in the GoToWebinar control panel that you see. So I'll get it started with a question here from Joel Minion. He says, firstly, terrific presentation. Any thoughts on dealing with larger data sets, for example, health research data that include Indigenous data as a subset? So for example, a study that includes Indigenous participants, but otherwise mostly drawn from the broader population. Does the Indigenous data need to be dealt with differently?
I would say yes. So one thing with kind of pulling out Indigenous data from those larger data research sets, I think it would also depend on the nature of that set. Is it historic data? Is it contemporary data? When it especially is historic data and it's Indigenous data, we can look back to the colonial realities in the countries that are at the time and kind of look at what's happening in that broader landscape. So especially, you know, in a Canadian context, health data for Indigenous people can be very traumatic and it can be very colonial and problematic. So pulling out health data from historic collections and working with communities on that can be really important. As well, for a more contemporary data set that has Indigenous data, I think it is important to also deal with Indigenous data on its own in those larger sets, because Indigenous communities, under the principle of Indigenous data sovereignty, do need to remain sovereign over that data. And that's important for communities in their self-governance practices. If you actually, when you get these slides, if you go to the First Nations Governance Center, they've been doing a lot of work on health data, and they would be a really great resource to connect with about Indigenous data, especially in the large kind of health data sets, and how to pull them out and how to work with communities. But yeah, in my opinion, I would definitely pull out that data and work with communities on it separately from the larger data set.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, we have another question here from Alex Clark. Wondering if you know what input OCAP and others had to the forthcoming tri-agency policy, and also how we can navigate situations when the principles or directives of policies don't point in the same direction.
Right, so I don't know what OCAP did for the tri-agencies. I do know of the tri-agencies changes. I worked a lot with James Dorian at the University of Alberta, who's the research data manager there, and we did have conversations around the tri-agency changes for data and the kind of Indigenous data portion of that. So I don't know what exactly OCAP kind of had for input or GITA. I'm sure if somebody is on this call that is from one of those organizations, if they want to put it in the chat, that would be appreciated. And then, sorry, what was the second part of that?
It was how can we navigate situations when the principles or directives of policies don't point in the same direction?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So when the policies don't point in the same direction, I think, we kind of had this thing about Indigenous people being the leaders of those conversations. So we do have, especially in Canada, and I'm sure in other countries, they do have Indigenous organizations that are kind of at the, they have the larger organizations. So in Canada, we have the Assembly of First Nations, we have the Métis National Council. So I think especially when larger policies, potentially like the tri-agency or anything like that, have these large policies that don't necessarily point in the same direction, that's almost the point where we have to have, our larger Indigenous governing bodies sitting down and working with these organizations in a way that makes sense for them, and really having our national leaders come together and making a stance on it to ensure that policies are working together and not separately from each other. We can, so myself as a librarian, I only have so much clout when it comes to changing large policies, not being a lawmaker or a politician or anything like that. I can advocate, but I think in some cases it does need reviewing and advocacy from our larger bodies.
Great, thanks. Another question here about if you know of any universities that have contracts or policies with local Indigenous communities about the ownership of knowledge that they may share with students, such as in Zoom recordings and
not that I know of for sharing on Zoom recordings or anything like that. I know that there are larger institutions that have that are working with like their digital collections or anything like that. But I think when it would be sharing information on Zoom or a virtual space, that's almost on the ethic of the instructor. And that's why it's important that we have conversations like this and start thinking about issues of who has the right to know and what we should be sharing in an Indigenous context. And it's all about learning. So I don't think I've ever heard of anything about Zoom or virtual spaces, but that's actually really important to think about. And thank you for raising that question. It has me thinking a lot about right now about virtual spaces and sharing of information. So yes, I would love to connect about that, and definitely feel free to reach out to me, because yeah, that's a great question for first thing in the morning, something to think about.
Great. So another question here. You mentioned ethics forms, and we have someone wondering if those are part of your research ethics board approvals, or is that a separate sort of standalone form?
No, so it's a separate standalone form. So these ethics forms that I'm talking about, they are in regards to kind of donor agreements and intake of digital and non-digital collections. So the ethics forms that I've worked on were when I was working in digital initiatives. And so this was part of just our donor agreement forms. So where they are, talking about the collection, what is involved in the collection, like how many items they have, what's the contents, this would be embedded into that. So it's a checklist that donors would have to check off information such as what is the age of the collection, is informed consent given, are minors being depicted in the collection, are Indigenous people being depicted in the collection. So that's kind of having researchers, donors think about and actually really critically think about the contents of their collection before they just give it all to a large university and say, I've been doing this research my whole life, or my grandpa or my dad, whoever, my grandma did all this research and I think the university would really like it and I want you to make it all open access. So it's really having people think critically about what they're donating before we actually go through the process of digitizing everything and thinking about making things open access. So it's having kind of that conversation with individuals about what actually they are giving us and who might have ownership. So taking ownership away from maybe the researcher and giving it back to community in that case.
Great. So we have a sort of bigger picture question here.
Okay.
How do you suggest beginning the relationship building process with First Nations communities?
Okay, so there's a few different ways that this can happen. I think it depends on where you're located and any already existing relationships that you might have. So when it comes to building relationships with communities, one of the biggest things is just reaching out. So this could just be, you know, sending an email to band council or to the community and just saying, like, introducing yourself. Another way is if we already have individuals that you know that might have connections to a community. So just reaching out and saying, hi, like, we have these collections, we really want to work with the community. Can you direct me to talking to anybody? When it comes to larger institutions like the University of British Columbia, U of A, U of T, so with the Canadian context, they have Indigenous centers at UBC. We're fortunate enough to have the Indigenous Research Support Initiative, so that's ERSI, which helps researchers make those connections with communities. A lot of times when it comes to relationship building with communities, it really is about just reaching out, being authentic, letting communities know why you're reaching out, and then also showing up, continuing to have those conversations, but also understanding, you know, in some cases, communities are very open to having conversations with individuals. However, you know, it depends on what's going on in that specific community. Right now with COVID happening, it's really hard to kind of reach out and have good conversations with communities because they have other things on their plate. So, you know, some communities, really great. We can have conversations with them. They're very open. And then other ones are just very busy. But it's always good to just let them know who you are and then also show up, listen, have tea. Drinking tea here is a big thing, drinking tea and just sharing food and having conversations. So
great, thanks for those great ideas. And then I'm going to squeeze in one more question here.
Okay.
This is sort of a more international perspective.
Okay.
We have a question about sub-Saharan Africa, and our participant says that little is being considered or discussed with respect to Indigenous data, despite the diverse ethnicities and Indigenous groups in the continent. How do you think iAssist as an organization can promote respect for Indigenous data beyond just North America and Europe? Another sort of big picture question here.
I think, so the big picture, I think one of the big things, I mean, and this is what I love about having these conversations and getting together is that now ISS has supported this through, you know, we've been brought together as individuals who are interested in Indigenous data sovereignty, who have ideas. So now you're connected to other individuals who you can definitely reach out to have these conversations about Indigenous data sovereignty in Africa. And we can look at kind of the similarities and the differences of the challenges and the issues that we're having and work together to advocate for changes. So I would love to see more panels in this webinar series, like an international panel would be great to hear other perspectives from different areas of the world and to learn about those similarities, those differences that individuals are having around Indigenous data sovereignty, the conversations that are happening. I know that's one thing that's been really important for me is I have definitely sat with some colleagues from New Zealand, Australia, the United States, Finland about what they're doing with Indigenous data sovereignty, and that can definitely inform our practices here in Canada as well. There are differences. All communities have differences with their data and their protocols. However, there are some similarities that we can kind of pull out and tweak our own policies based off of those similarities. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's a really great note to end on here. I do, like you say, sort of really hope that this is kind of the beginning of a broader conversation and more connections between, our very diverse IASSIST community, but also, other organizations and people working in this area. I love the idea of an international panel too. That's great. I know in our series, I think we're expecting to have some folks talk on this topic from Australia. But yeah, a panel would really help sort of bridge all of those sort of international ideas. So I really appreciate your time, Kayla. This was just a wonderful, wonderful talk. There were questions we didn't get to, but maybe we can take a note of those and sort of get answers to folks through different means. But we will also, of course, share the slides and the presentation. And we really appreciate you and everyone's participation today. Amy, I don't know if you had any other words to close off here.
No, just thank you both. Kayla, that was fantastic. I will just summarize the questions asked, but people really enjoyed the presentation and there were many, many, many thanks. And so we'll be sharing that with you. Thank you, Kayla.
Yeah, thank you.